Okay, hello. Good morning or afternoon or good evening, depending on where in the world you're joining us from. My name is Corey Klein. I'm the Executive Director of the Kleinman Center for Energy Policy. I have the pleasure of welcoming you to our event today on the last day of Penn's Energy Week, which I have to say has been an incredibly full, rich, interesting lineup of events on campus and virtually. But we like to save the best for the end. So I'm very happy that you've all joined us for this conversation today with author Kim Stanley Robinson and Penn professor Zeid Ra'ad Al Hussein. Just a couple of housekeeping things. The event is going to be recorded. It's going to be available on our website tomorrow. And second, Stan and Zeid are going to be in conversation with each other for the first half of the program, but I'm going to turn my video back on and share some questions from the audience that you've submitted in the Q&A function. So if you have a question, if you can put that in the Q&A function, not in the chat function, that's going to make my life a lot easier. So thanks for that. So the Kleinman Center team, we are big fans of Stan. We've read his work, and most recently, like so many other members of the Penn community, we had the privilege of seeing him speak at COP27 in Glasgow last fall. He is a world-renowned author for his science fiction and this newer genre of climate fiction or sci-fi. He's published dozens of titles. And several of his storylines, like those he weaved together in his most recent book, The Ministry for the Future, take a deep look at the effects of climate change. So rising temperatures, sea level rise, food shortages, global instability, mass extinction, all of these futures that we're trying to limit through our exploration of options and action today. And that's why we thought he was going to be a fantastic guest for this last day of Energy Week. He's really not only a great researcher, as is evidenced in his books, but also a real leader and visionary. Just a couple of his bona fides. He is a New York Times bestselling author. And in 2008, Time magazine named him Hero of the Environment, a title that I'm admittedly very jealous of. He's won more awards than you can imagine. And as mentioned, his latest novel, The Ministry for the Future, was one of Barack Obama's favorite books in 2020. Another bona fide I'm a little jealous of. And today we're also lucky to have here in conversation with Stan Zeid Ra'ad Al Hussein. Zeid is the Perry Worldhouse Professor of Law and Human Rights at Penn. He's had a long career as a Jordanian diplomat, including as permanent representative to the UN and then later as ambassador to the United States. He represented Jordan before the International Court of Justice. He served on the UN Security Council. He's been a peacekeeper. He played an important role in the establishment of the International Criminal Court. And most recently, in addition to being at Penn, he was named president and CEO of the International Peace Institute. So I am delighted to be with both of you today. Thank you again for joining us. And with that, I'm going to turn the microphone over to you both, and I will see you in half an hour.
Well, thank you, Corey, for that introduction. And Stan, it's such a pleasure to be doing this with you. I think we should disclose to our audience that, in effect, this is a continuation of a discussion, a conversation that began in Glasgow, where you were asking me about my own impressions of how COP was being structured. And I think it was so intense was the conversation that I think both of us thought that we should take it on the road. And yes. So in effect, this is what it's become now.
Yes, this is a great next step. And I have to say, at Glasgow, I was a newbie. I had never been to a COP before, and it's overwhelming and disorienting and not obvious really what's going on there. So you were my teacher, and we had, you and your people had established a little table in the cafeteria as a kind of an informal discussion space. And that was one of the best spaces I had at COP26, and it's good to continue it here.
Yeah. Well, the interesting thing for me, Stan, is you are a celebrated author. I came into climate change really quite late. I mean, I had the privilege of getting to know Corey, and we all know Michael Weisberg, our colleague at Perry Worldhouse, who's very involved. your interest in the environment began very early, though, unlike me. I mean, you sort of almost as you were an academic and beginning to write, you focused on the environment early. What was it? Was it living in California, growing up in California, that sort of sparked it, or was there a sort of seminal event that sort of got you thinking along that trajectory?
Well, I grew up in Southern California, which I think is what turned me into a science fiction writer. It was agricultural land that got urbanized before my eyes. And when I ran into science fiction, it really was the literature that felt most realistic and moving. And I was a convert to science fiction. That this was a life on the beaches, and I started going to the Sierra Nevada. I'm very aware of landscape and thought that this was something science fiction was usually missing, since it was an urban literature of spaceships and robots. It was something I could bring. And along the way, I made a trip to Antarctica, and all the scientists down there, this was 1995, were talking about climate change.
Right.
And I began to get interested. And if you're doing near future science fiction, so talking about what might come in the next century, climate took over. There was no other story about this coming century that we're in right now, 20 years into it, that didn't involve an over consideration that was going to impact everything else, which was climate change.
Right.
So I started writing about it about 20 years ago. Now tell me about you. You were doing human rights things, and
Yeah.
there you were at Glasgow.
Yeah, no, I have to say that I was one of these loathsome people who is very slow to basically catch on how important this is. I wasn't at the Paris COP. I perhaps should have been. Someone from my office when I was human rights chief was there, but by and large, the human rights community is not in attendance, and nor is it following it closely. At Glasgow, it was only the Secretary General of Amnesty International who was there briefly, and then of course Mary Robinson and representatives of the indigenous persons and also the youth movement. But beyond that, the big human rights organizations were not there. I first began to understand the implications of this when, as a member of the Elders Group, the group set up by Nelson Mandela, we were given a briefing on geoengineering or solar radiation modification. And I think all of us were rather stunned because it seemed to be so extreme in to a certain respect, a sort of a Hail Mary pass. And right away, it sort of triggered in us this thinking about governance. Well, how on earth could you regulate an attempt to do this? And perhaps if to the uninitiated, maybe you could tell them what solar radiation modification is. But it seemed to be a desperate gamble to try and limit the effects of global warming. And if unregulated, could have terrible side effects, further exacerbating the harm done in certain regions as opposed to alleviating it. And that's when I first began to think about it. So I'm very late, very slow. Obviously, you're much brighter than I am, Stan. So, but perhaps you could tell the audience what this form of geoengineering is, just because you focus on quite a few different approaches in Ministry for the Future, but perhaps this one is something that they should be aware of.
Sure. And I think it's getting well known, but very quickly I can recapitulate. When the Pinatubo volcano went off in the Philippines in the 90s, it lowered world temperatures by a couple of degrees for about 5 years. And it was noticed that humanity actually has the physical power to imitate that, to cast dust into the high atmosphere, the stratosphere, and therefore cool temperatures. And it was, even the people studying it were nervous about it. They still are. The term geoengineering has become a bad one. It's sort of the name for desperate bad things that we do to try to get away with our bad behavior of burning fossil fuels. So when it has that definition, naturally it looks bad. But amongst these emergency gestures, that might be possible and might turn out to be necessary. If we break certain planetary boundaries, 5 years of cooled temperatures might be really helpful to avoid mass deaths and a continuing degradation of the overall situation. So no one's happy about it. It isn't as if there are techno optimists that are advocating it as the great solution to all our ills. It's really being regarded as an emergency move that we might have to make, and is being studied as such. Governance then becomes important. And what I was noticing at COP was that you have been a life in international diplomacy, in international organizations. You are a kind of a technician or a structuralist of how international diplomacy works from a lifetime of practice, but also you have theory. And what I was noticing at COP was that you had essentially a theory of COP, of what was good about it, but what was also not quite hamstringing it, but slowing it down. And tell us about that, because I don't think many people, I certainly didn't, and I think many people don't have a good understanding of how COP runs and how it might run better.
Yeah, well, I was discussing this in class with my good old friend, Professor Bill Burke-White, last Tuesday. You know, when you look at countries, and so many countries now are highly polarized, you will often find that the political parties jostling for power can almost not agree on a single thing, and most particularly when it comes to deciding on the budget. But they seem to be in endless disagreement. So try and imagine how it is that 193 countries can actually produce an outcome, a treaty. It's almost a miracle that you can have a treaty on anything, a multilateral treaty, a treaty that binds everyone, negotiated by everyone. The only way you can produce it is by using technique. I mean, an enormous amount of technique to get to a position where you have the 193 in agreement. And as cardinal, a key instrument to arrive at a strong consensus on a binding agreement is the use or the threat of the use of the vote. The vote is it's a charter right under the UN Charter, and that informs all the other bodies that regulate so much of what goes on in this on the planet. And yet, when it came to COP, in the first two COPs, it was decided that that right to vote would be essentially held in suspension. And so everything had to be agreed to by consensus, which also meant that 193 countries, each one of which now had a veto. And so it seemed to be, I mean, it's a no-brainer that you will then end up with weak outcomes if you have such a system in place. I mean, just imagine for a second, Stan, we have the ongoing fighting in Ukraine, and it quite possibly could escalate further, and of course, in the next few months. And so what is to prevent the Russian Federation from just throwing sand into the complete machinery and saying at every stage of in the next 2 or 3 years in the climate change negotiations that they're not agreeing or they disagree? And we've created a system which allows for that, which allows for one country to block the whole thing. And that's what I was completely astonished by. I mean, let's hope it doesn't happen, because it'll imperil all of us. But we need to think more clearly about how one achieves a stronger consensus, because I think very soon, the patience of various governments, we can see the youth movement beginning to feel enormous frustration. You're in direct contact with the scientific community, and I understand, perhaps you can confirm this or not, or otherwise, that many in the scientific community feel burnt out and quite frustrated too at the pace at which the changes are happening in the context of COP. But is that a fair assessment of where the scientific community is?
Yes, I think so. I mean, it is a giant and interlocking set of communities, so it's hard to generalize, but I think it's safe to say that everybody is in that feeling that we the scientific community has laid out where we're going and what we need to do in terms of rapid decarbonization. And then we do have the COP mechanism where the nations come together, look at that scientific evidence, and promise to do things. And it's a kind, I concluded after COP that because it isn't a legally binding treaty and there is no sheriff, and it has this inherent slowness that you've described, or the conservative nature of it by requiring consensus for every statement. And we saw this at the end of Glasgow, where the promise to phase out coal turned into phase down coal to please, to satisfy and get on board China and India in a kind of an overtime agreement. Well, that's always going to happen. And it's not just the scientific community, it's everybody going to be looking at the one venue that we have for all the nations to come and discuss things, a kind of general assembly without a Security Council, really. But because of this consensus rule, quite weak and slow, but it's all we have. So at that point, you have a dilemma where, as you've pointed out, small shifts and adjustments in technique might lead to more power to the outcome. And I'd be interested to hear your thoughts on what some of those might be.
Yeah, I'm a great believer in small but critical modifications. You know, it's almost, you know, as we progress through life, we learn a great deal, and we make mistakes. We have to sort of back up and take the exit that we missed. That sort of approach to things. So I think, I mean, that's where I think the key lies in terms of now, as we approach these critical moments in terms of the global goal on adaptation, the stock take, the ratcheting up, and the need to really make progress. And one of the things that you did make me think about is that in reading your work, Stan, I sort of feel that you, of course, in one way you want to project the science, the understanding of science in a way that everyone could more or less understand. But in your writings, I sort of feel also this deep urge to influence the policymakers, people who could be in a position to affect outcomes as well. It's almost like you want to, you know, by blending hard science and plausibility and imagination, you're wanting to urge us into the direction which you've sort of thrown out there as being entirely possible if the right energies and the right amount of goodwill is invested, and we somehow change the global political infrastructure, or let's say the machinery, the economic and political, more economic perhaps. But is that a sort of a correct assessment of the way that you've approached your work, that you're almost willing us on, you can sense it in the writing, for us who can maybe take the right decisions at the right time to do the right thing?
Yes, I think that's right. This is part and parcel of being a utopian science fiction writer. And utopia has, as a word, has a reputation. It's the good place that no one will ever get to. It's impossible. But utopian science fiction has been an ongoing project, and I have great precursors, and sometimes it is influential. Not that it introduces new ideas, but it organizes already existing ideas into a story that people can read and follow and say, yes, that could happen. So realistic utopia, it sounds like a paradox, but it's a form of the novel that I'm interested in. So I mean, in New York 2140, I was fooling around. It was 2017. I was having more fun. By the time I got to Ministry for the Future, dystopia obtruded. If temperatures get too high, people will die. And so the first chapter of Ministry for the Future is absolutely the opposite of utopia. But it was you that told me at COP, you don't have to be in a plane crash to know that it would be bad for you. And so the first chapter of Ministry serves as kind of an imaginary plane crash. Okay, we know that would be bad. Let's not get into that situation. After that, what I was trying to do was organize into one narrative all the good things that could happen in a messy, realistic way, with setbacks, with mistakes. and still at the end of it have people believe, at least notionally or provisionally believe, that, yeah, that could happen. So now utopia has been redefined as, if we can dodge a mass extinction event in this century, that is a utopian history at this point. Because right now we're headed for it, and it would be disastrous on the level that you came into things in terms of human welfare, the refugees, the things that you've seen that I have not in real life that are already happening. Climate change is already hammering the world, but on the margins. And so a story like mine brings all these elements to center stage for people who are still living comfortable lives until the climate, some climate event hits them. But meanwhile, we're comfortable enough that we have to think through these things and still imagine that our good individual works would result in a good outcome for the world if they all add up but what I think you're bringing to the discussion is, it has to be organized and structured. It can't be a flailing. It can't be completely disorganized.
No, that's right. I mean, it was Jonas Rostrom who got me thinking about the flying analogy. I mean, he was saying that, you know, there's, I think, a 4% or 6% chance we will reach a 4 degrees centigrade mark above pre-industrial levels. And he said, you know, 6% is very high. If there was a 6% chance you would die in a plane crash, you wouldn't fly, because hundreds of thousands of people would be dying every day. But it got me thinking about this, because ICAO, the International Civil Aviation Authority, has a category of regulations which, when adopted, is immediate hard law in every country, not debated in the US Congress or the UK House of Commons or parliaments and national assemblies. You know, there's no question that it becomes hard law, and we accept it. You know, and we accept it because no one wants to step on a plane that crashes into another plane. So if we see the planet as this vehicle traveling through space, why can't we likewise strengthen COP and take it some way in the direction of, I mean, we have the Paris Climate Agreement, but move it all in the direction of ICAO, where we are not invoking sovereignty every 2 seconds to block things and parley with various quarters that may have other agenda, but take these issues with the seriousness that you've highlighted, and I think rightly bring to public attention. Do you, Stan? You are so celebrated as a gifted author in this area. Do you see young authors following you along this track that you've sort of established, or have you mentored or been willing to mentor young authors who are similarly developing an interest in science, in the hard science, which you have this knack for? I mean, you're a scientist yourself, or one would think that you're a scientist yourself.
Yes, well, I'm just an English major, but I'm married to a scientist, and it's a matter of sentences. I'm good at pastiche. I can write the sentences. But yes, I helped to run the Clarion Science Fiction Writers Workshop, which is a 6-week summer workshop for beginning writers. And I've done that for many years, and talk to classes when the opportunity arises. And I'm part of the science fiction community, which is very tight. It's like a small town, but scattered around the world. And I do see younger writers, what used to be looking like castor oil fiction, I would call it, like it's good for you, but you don't like it. And what I would represent in the community as a kind of a Boy Scout virtuous and not particularly fun form of fiction, that has changed. In the world of climate change, to write about it is simply to do realism. And in science fiction and fantasy, that's a kind of realism, in that you go into a dream state to describe how things really feel in the real world. So climate fiction is becoming a burgeoning genre as being the most relevant form of literature in our time. And there's movements like solar punk, or hope punk, which I hate this suffix punk, but it doesn't matter. These are groups of young people trying to establish literary schools, which give them some collaborative power in numbers, and gives them a label by which they can be understood, which is important for readers, especially in the age of Amazon. You know, what kind of fiction are you doing? Well, now there's a lot of young people doing climate fiction, and it makes perfect sense. It is the overriding situation that we're in. So if you try to imagine futures without climate change, you really are doing something so strange that I don't think there are many examples of it anymore. So yes, it's happening. And in mine, what I think I was able to do with an already existing career was highlight that these are interesting stories, and then also to bring in the economics, to write about finance in the way that, say, Michael Lewis writes about finance. There's no doubt you can make fascinating stories about finance because it's money, it's life, it's greed and altruism. It's all these things combined in a topic everybody feels they understand. And so in Ministry, one of the reasons I think that book succeeded was to get into finance and to say, can we do carbon quantitative easing? And this is, again, international. It would take a lot of central banks to back such a thing for it to have any power in the world. And if you are paying people to decarbonize with, say, $1 trillion or $2 trillion a year that is made up from scratch, I believe this is the solution to a problem that you again pointed out in Glasgow, that the developed nations are incredibly tight-fisted, that they aren't fulfilling their promises, that nobody likes to give away their money. Nobody, not individually or at the level of rich nations. But if it's new money made up from scratch, if nobody owned it in the first place, but it was just made up by the world community to reward decarbonizing work, this seems to me a crucial element of the picture. And again, it would take international organization, particularly if you were paying some of the petrostates to keep their fossil fuels in the ground. Well, this looks bizarre. It looks like paying blackmailers or whatever, but we've all relied on these fossil fuels. And those nations are in trouble. The petrostates that have been incompetent in saving their profits from selling their fossil fuels, they are looking down the end of a gun. And if they become a failed state, then again, we have the refugees. Again, we have a world in disarray. So this is another problem of financing our way through the salvation of of saving the countries that will go under because they're so devoted to their fossil fuels, of helping them, giving them a lifeline. And maybe, again, as you say, this would impinge on sovereignty, and it would clarify that we are all member states of one planet. We are not actually independent planets where we can rule our nation as if it had no relation to the rest of the nation. That's an absurdity in this world. So it's part of to be able to write about that, I think that was the reason I was at Glasgow. I got invited because of the introduction of global finance into ordinary fiction.
And we're getting very close to the Q&A, and I can see the questions are beginning to pile up. How did the world of finance react to your, suggestion there be a carbon coin, the quantitative easing, basically looking at this as a model for keeping the oil in the ground? I mean, did they think, Robinson's lost his mind, or did they think, Robinson, you might have something here and we need to sort of sit and really talk about this?
Well, there's two parts to it. The idea that there would be carbon quantitative easing and maybe a carbon reward, that if you drew carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere, you get paid for it more than you had to spend to do it, so you could make your living at it. The central banks are studying this. The Network for Greening the Financial System is an organization of 89 of the biggest central banks, including all the ones you would want. And they are studying this and have a white paper about it. And greening the financial system is one name for this process. And happily, this isn't just my idea, but it's being studied by economists. And there are now teams around the world studying how this could be implemented. It's very reassuring if you want to have hope. The further suggestion that the petrostates will need to be compensated for keeping it in the ground, well, now this pushes it too far. It's too much money, it's rewarding bad actors. There are many reasons to object to it. And I've been worried that it is nevertheless still necessary. And I guess I've just been asking it as a question for people working on this topic. If you're to get paid for drawing down carbon, ought you not to get paid at perhaps a discounted, amortized, and entailed way for keeping it in the ground in the first place? And this is, I think it's a push, a new question that is going to have to be answered. But it is new, and a lot of people just shake their heads. The calculations run into the thousands of trillions of dollars, and so clearly some discounting and amortization would be necessary to make it work even in a small way. But otherwise, how is a country like, say, Nigeria, Venezuela, Mexico, the people who governments own those fossil fuels, those governments are going to go down. That's nearly 1 billion people right there. I mean, how are they going to get through this century without some kind of a lifeline?
Yeah, no, and your point about the global north being loath to make public monies available. I mean, it was clearly shown in Glasgow, where what was initially proposed by Hillary Clinton, the 100 billion a year. I mean, not even a fraction of that, well, a fraction of it, 30 billion was made available. And that was including, of course, ODA already, the overseas development assistance already sort of calculated into it. I see Corey has joined us. Stan, this is a conversation which will continue to evolve for many years, I hope.
Yes.
So it's been a delight to have this discussion with you. And Corey, over to you.
There's so many great questions in the chat, and I think actually we'll start with one of the first ones. So the conversation between you started talking about solar geoengineering as an example, and this question is really specifically about stratospheric aerosol injection and about changing the narrative that you were both talking about right now is kind of the new technology can sometimes be plagued with this narrative that this is an excuse to continue to justify our use of fossil fuels. But I kind of want to take that even in a slightly different direction and apply that to carbon dioxide removal, right? Something that we're seeing in all of the reports that are coming out that say this is going to be a necessary piece of our future if we're going to limit global warming. So how do you, either of you or both of you, think about changing that narrative? What are the techniques that are available to us?
Well, you can hit the alarm, the fire alarm in the hotel. It's a kind of you can insist that the moral hazard argument is from 1990 and we are in 2020, and this is an all hands on deck moment, and nobody is suggesting that carbon removal or solar geoengineering is anything but an emergency gesture. Rapid decarbonization is now generally understood to be necessary. And then the other things are even doing that, which we're not doing very well, but hypothetically, if we were to decarbonize as rapidly as possible, we still have too much CO2 in the atmosphere. Drawing it down by natural means, by mechanical means, by every means possible. This is where some carbon quantitative easing to pay for that you can make your living doing that. It would be best if we got back to 350 parts per million of CO2 in the atmosphere. And right now we're at nearly 420 and we're headed for 450. That's an awful lot of carbon dioxide to draw down, and it's going to take a civilizational effort. It will be a new industry. It may involve forests and kelp beds and biochar, and there's probably 50 methodologies. And all of them need to be paid for, need to be a way to make a living. And to do that, this is at least how I feel about it.
Yeah, I think it's also important that publics are not surprised that the disruption caused by the suddenness of a change that is required, or a way of living that needs to be adapted to, has to happen sort of quite, not gradually, but has to be eased in carefully. I've been looking at the enormous violence that came as a result of the issuance of the map following India and Pakistan's independence. The following day, a map was issued. No one really had been, well, let's say a few people had been consulted, and the surprise and the shock of it created an enormous amount of movement, mass movement, 10 million people, 5 million in each direction. And the violence that ensued over 6 weeks was horrific. And I mean, if that were to be a parallel, you can't have political leaders keep their people in the dark about what are the likely decisions that these countries may have to take. And if it comes as a rush, in 10, 15 years' time, that alone will be an enormous compression. I don't think would be able to survive. So I think, very careful thinking about how a public discussion is fostered. And so you're all in on the suggested consequence, or let's say the decisions to be taken, which are consequential.
So Zeid, are you referring to new models of global governance?
Potentially, yes. But I think the idea of preparing your people for the sorts of scenarios that Stan raises in his books, for the sorts of machinery we need. It's hard for one to explain why we have a Human Rights Council that's permanent, that's peer reviewing all the countries on the planet, and we don't have a Climate Change Council that's similarly permanent. We have the UNFCCC, it's a treaty-based system. We meet once a year or maybe twice a year, but it's not a permanent body, which is what you have in the context of human rights. And so why don't we have something like that, right? And I think the thing is we need to have a really good discussion about whether or not we have to adapt the machinery of decision-making to meet what it is that we're likely to confront, and also to prepare our publics for a certain way of living, which we have to accept as part of the bargain for our continued existence. And so I think that part of it is equally important. And whenever you surprise your public with a shock policy, the outcome is not generally very good. And I worry that that's where we're headed.
Stan, there's a question about the solutions that are kind of proposed or explored in Ministry for the Future really seem to be, we're solving a global problem with global solutions, right? These are very high level kind of policy choices. And this audience member is asking, what's the place for local communities? What's the place, I think, even down to the level of the individual in this vision for the future?
Well, it's a good question, and I'm glad it was asked. Thank you. I came away from Glasgow in a state of shock, and it was partly because of things that Zeid was teaching me there and seeing the whole thing and thinking everybody needs to go home and realize that COP is a place where we talk to each other and display what we've done and what our intentions are. But then you've got to go home and do it through the year. And every town on earth has a climate group now that's already working. So you don't have to invent the wheel, you just put your shoulder to it. And I've come back to Cool Davis and have been participating here. To work in your local watershed is very gratifying after you've been at the global level, which is so abstract, so hypothetical, and so bound up in problems you can't solve. But you can, in fact, plant a tree and do these things that, although they look small, when they aggregate, when you understand that what you're doing is just one brick in a gigantic wall that all humanity is also doing. This is another reason I think Ministry had its success, was that it was showing that there are multiple efforts that are not well coordinated with each other and often don't even know about each other, that nevertheless are aggregating to a possibly good result. So chapter 85, I think, of my novel is just a list. It takes 15 minutes to read it aloud of all of the, these aren't all, a representative list of organizations that are working on the ground in local communities. And I think it was important to put that in there to suggest that the international level, the global level, is crucial, because otherwise things happen incoherently and they flail. And also, it's possible to exploit and parasitically ruin those kind of good efforts if they aren't agreed upon internationally. So in other words, you need both top down, bottom up, and side to side at the regional levels. And because it's an all hands on deck situation, there are many ways to put your shoulder to the wheel. There really are, and it feels good.
Mhm.
Yeah, there are so many industries that ought to be playing a more direct role in this. So together with our team from Penn, I was privileged to be in the Maldives a few weeks ago, and we had lengthy discussions with the government. And you realize that the travel and tourism industry, and in particular the resort owners and those who manage resorts, are their record when it comes to working these issues is sort of incomplete. There's some that are willing to invest and help the local communities in their endeavors. Others really are on the sidelines and not involved at all. And I would suppose that it's not just the travel and tourism industry, it's the infrastructure industry as well, and many others, that if they can only be stimulated, not just by the investment climate, but by the need to actually work together in lockstep with local communities and help them overcome the difficulties they face, would be a huge push forward.
There's a really fantastic question here also about kind of these two ends of the spectrum, looking both at climate denialism and climate change disinformation on the one hand, and then climate anxiety on the other hand, and how you think we can grapple with kind of both ends of the spectrum.
Stan, this is for you.
Well, Corey, say it again.
So let's start with the first part. So there's so much climate denialism and climate change disinformation that is out there in the world today. Mm-hmm. And how do we, as people who think that this is going to be one of or the defining issue of our time, how do we deal with the pervasiveness of that disinformation?
Well, I say go for a working political majority in the political system you're in, and forget about trying to convince people who are going to hold to this as a kind of a self-identity, a religious conviction. You can't convince them with stories or logic or facts or graphs or scare stories. They won't be convinced. So it's a waste of time. It's the middle. It's the people who are open-minded, of which there are very many. And it's also working political majorities are 51%, 55%, occasionally 60%. Get those working majorities, pass the laws, and in 5 years, the structure of feeling in society at large will have changed such that those people who are denialists, if they are, will have gone away. Not gone away, they will have changed their views without admitting it because the general culture will have changed. One thing I say to people in the middle is, a doctor can come out to you and say, look, you're asymptomatic right now, but we see that you're going to die if you don't let us poison you to within an inch of your life. We're going to poison you, and it's going to kill the disease in you faster than you die. And that's your only chance. And people say, yes, poison me. So this is the kind of trust we have in science when your life is on the line. And I find many people take that in and think, well, yeah, I mean, I had chemotherapy last year, or my cousin did, or my wife. And so then you begin to think, well, okay, it's the same scientific community telling us that the biosphere is sick, and the biosphere is our extended body. So as a matter of persuasion for people who are open-minded, the case can be made very powerfully. For people who are convinced that their self-identity is involved in being the ones that know right, the skeptics, the opposition, the whatever, well, you have to just outvote them and over legislate them and do what needs to be done.
And maybe for both of you, Zeid, I don't know if you want to jump in on that disinformation piece, but the second part of the question was about how do we approach climate anxiety, right? This thing that we are now talking about, especially with our youth. What's the right way to deal with that? What's the right messaging?
So Stan's response, this last one, was brilliant. I mean, I'm going to pinch it from him and use the same argument, but always sort of credit him with having said it. You know, Corey, when we were in the Maldives 2 weeks ago, and we were snorkeling out at, looking at the reefs, for the most part bleached, and this is now common everywhere, or in most oceans. We came across a young lady who, together with her sister, every week she goes out and clears out, there's quite a large section where we were, clears out the dead coral and installs sort of live coral. And we asked her, we said, so you do this every week? And she said, yes. And I said, even if the weather is terrible? And she said, yes. Even if you're sick? Yes. Just two individuals every week going out there and doing what they can. And, if all of us were like that, we could turn this around. And they were not seeking fame. They were not seeking fortune. And it was actually quite interesting to see them doing this work in coordination with the Ministry of Environment. But I don't think the big resorts were heavily invested in this. And in some of the resorts in the Maldives, people are spending 50,000 a night there. So the amount of money being generated is phenomenal. So I think need just to think differently. And as Stan was saying, it's amazing when you fly to these low-lying atolls, because there are these little drops of turquoise and emerald in the middle of the ocean. And you just put your head an inch under the surface and you see what's happening. I mean, when coral is bleached, there's very little marine life. And when you come across live coral, it's rich in color and life. And what a lovely parallel to the way that we should ourselves live and embrace diversity and care for and respect the planet and live with nature and not dominate it in the way that we have done for far too long.
That's lovely. I think, Stan, this is a question for you about storytelling and about specific kinds of climate storytelling that are not yet used, but that might have a place, and especially about your thoughts on performing arts as a mode of storytelling.
All across the arts, you can see climate becoming a topic, and often in striking ways. And I love in particular theater. Thornton Wilder's The Skin of Our Teeth, that should be brought out as a climate fiction with immense force, a beautiful play about humanity over the long haul. And like a couple of the characters, as I recall, are baby dinosaurs. It's a marvelous piece of art, and it suggests what can be done, since that play comes from maybe 1940. But looking at the long view, theater has a magic. And of course, movies are like a direct slap in the face. And speaking of that, what movies can do that books can't is give you faces, specifically human faces, talking to each other, talking to you. No sentence can do it. What simply movies can do. And I'm struck by that each art has an ability that other art forms don't have. Music can hook our emotions immediately and non-verbally. It's kind of magical what music can do, and musicians know how to do it, and the rest of us are the beneficiaries. So I think all of the arts, and not only that, but every human endeavor, whatever field you happen to be in, it has now a climate angle. It's part of the project. But in the arts, the more the better. And I did a collaboration with Marina Abramovich once, and she's a genius. She's the Shakespeare of performance art, and indeed turned it from something that you would see in streets and carnivals into something that you see in opera houses and worldwide stagings, including movies. And she's inspired a whole generation. What is performance art? Andy Goldsworthy, landscape art, using pieces of the already existing landscape and arranging them into art forms that are ephemeral. Well, that was something that people did down at the beach for fun, and now it's in the National Gallery and is something. So transformative artists can transform an entire art form And I think that's going to happen for climate.
So I have to ask this next question because it just follows directly onto that. And Michael, I don't think this is a frivolous question, but how do you think, if you look at some of the classic science fiction writers and pioneers, how do you think that they would have incorporated climate change into their storytelling? And how do you think that may have kind of shifted the trajectory, public consciousness, where we are today? I love this question.
Well, yeah, but it was done. It was done, and people are ready. John Wyndham, this was often a British thing, and the climactic destruction of the planet was seen as a metaphor for the end of the British Empire. And I think there's truth to that. But if you look at the work of J.G. Ballard, he changed the climate of the world repeatedly through the 60s. The crystal world, the drowned world, the wind from nowhere, the burning world. I mean, he was obsessed by this. And then someone like John Wyndham or Asimov, that's a good example. The Martian Way. Asimov would have said, well, let's engineer our way out of this. And indeed, he wrote a piece in 1964. What was the world going to be like in 2014, 50 years in the future? Amazing essay for the New York Times. You can find it online and my analysis of it online. Asimov was a smart man, well-educated and thoughtful. He saw the population pulse coming in 64 in a way that no one else saw. And I would say that for most of them, although they changed planetary climates all the time and called it terraforming, which is how I got to my Mars novel, and terraforming is from Jack Williamson, 1938, they would have been great on terraforming Earth, which is one of Jack Williamson's final novels when he was almost 100 years old. But nobody could believe it. It's like Thomas Huxley said, you could never fish all the fish out of the ocean. Very smart scientist, 19th century, didn't understand trawling and steel ships. He didn't have them to think about. So early science fiction writers, they didn't understand the power of CO2 and the number of humans. And a lot of people talk about the Great Acceleration in historical terms. Since World War II, we've been in the Great Acceleration. Every metric you use to measure human activity has shot up since then. Well, it's very hard to see that kind of thing coming, to tell you the truth.
So I think this may end up being our last question. And this is from Walter, who's one of our fourth-year PhD students in chemistry here at Penn. And he's mentioned, Stan, at the beginning, you said, I was writing about utopian futures in 2017. And then by 2019, I'm writing about dystopian futures and looking at all these incredibly dire reports that are coming out of the IPCC or, the failure of the Build Back Better plan here in the US. The question is about hope, right? How do you stay hopeful as individuals, and how do we stay hopeful as a society? And frankly, is there a place for hope?
Oh, yes. Well, thank you for that. And also, I want to turn this over to Zeid and ask him to tell us about the refugee camps that he has visited in terms of hope. For me personally, it's a political obligation. I mean, I'm a well-off American suburban male, a baby boomer. For me to lose hope would be ridiculous and a moral failing. And also, I would point out that hope is biological, that the cells hope. They hope for ATP. When you feel hunger, you're hoping for the next meal. So you got to generalize and biologize hope, and then use it as a political spur for yourself and for others. But Zeid, tell us more.
Well, I know, I think that's right. Sometimes you would come across an IDP camp, internally displaced camp, people who had been living under sheets of corrugated iron and tarpaulin for 30 years. And yet you would sit with them and they wouldn't have just crumbled sort of psychologically. They always expect that they would be delivered out of this. And they are, people who have a nobility about them. I was constantly aghast at something else that we were doing at the UN, which is sometimes we would, sort of work our way through a refugee camp and an IDP camp, almost sort of treating it as something that isn't human. It's something to gawp at. then quite, I think, rightly being put in our place that these are people with great dignity and people who we had to talk to as equals, and people who had, of course, a considerable amount of their life occupied by these let's say, the need to survive, and yet never diminished in their optimism that their situation could change. And I think Stan is right. I mean, we are all very privileged, many of us. And if we are seen to flail or give up, it is, rank treachery, perhaps. We cannot. We have to keep working away. As the two girls we met in the Maldives every week, going in and putting new coral where dead coral exists. And I think that's the way we should all approach it, and not despair, but be seized and willing to change the world that we live in for the better, of course.
Stan, any last parting words?
I would like to add that if you and your audience is interested, I always offer to answer the unanswered questions in the Q&A by email afterwards. If you have email addresses, if people are interested, you'll send me that list. I call it a velocity exercise. It's just a couple sentences. I go very fast, but I don't like it if people bother to ask questions. I think they should be answered. And beyond that, I think what Zeid finished with there is really the best. That's a good way to end.
Well, we will absolutely connect you with those questions. And thank you, Stan, Zeid. Thank you both so much for sharing this time with us and participating in Energy Week. For everybody in the audience, today is obviously the last day of Energy Week, but there's a couple more events that you can register for at energyweek.upenn.edu. And last, I just want to mention that our Carnot Prize this year is going to be April 19th. Registration is open. This year, we are awarding this prize to Nicholas Stern of LSE. So he'll be on campus with us, and we'll be recognizing his distinguished contributions to the field of energy policy. So hope to see you all soon. And Zeid and Stan, thank you so much for a great hour.
Thank you.
Corey.
Yeah,
Thank
Zeid,
you,
let's do it. Yeah, we'll do it again.
Absolutely. We'll do it again.
All right.
Okay. Take care.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.